Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today is all about dip dyeing yarn. We are going to dip dye some sock yarn into two different colors of commercial acid dyes to create some repeating variegated colorways in a really fun and easy way for people to do. You just need a dedicated dye pot. But before we get into it, let's give a huge thank you and shout out to today's lab partner, Katie. Katie, thank you so much for supporting this video, and I really hope that you're going to love the yarn that we create. I dip dye yarn all the time. I do it a lot, but most often with a yarn mop or a leftover color as just a way, oh, I've got some dry yarn, let's dip dye it. I also love to dip dye yarn to break colors. Color breaking is when you have one color mixture, but the colors and the hues separate. So for example, with Wilton's Violet, you get these bright magentas and blues in the yarn. So the technique that we're going to use today is one where it might end up looking like broken colors without actually being broken colors, if that makes sense. But let's get into it. In my 8-quart dedicated dye pot, I have about 16 cups of water, and we are going to add, let's see, about 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. This is a concentration I like to start with a lot. My tap water does run slightly acidic, so you may need more or less acid than what I'm using. The first color that we are going to use today is Jacquard Fire Red. And I'm going to add 100 milliliters of this color to our pot that is warming up. We are going to be dyeing 200 grams of yarn at a time. So this would be the equivalent of 1 gram of dye per 200 grams of yarn. But since we're dip dyeing, saying the exact depth of shade isn't really helpful because the end that goes in first is going to have a much deeper shade than the end that goes in at the end. But we're now going to let this heat up so that way we can dip dye our yarn for the first round. We are starting to simmer, so I'm going to reduce the heat to low so that way it'll be easier to see what is happening. Now, this time we are not going to fold the yarn at all for the first one. We're going to start by dipping one end into the yarn until we hit, I guess, the end. Now, the one correction I'm doing here at the beginning off camera is making sure that my zip ties, and here's our pre-soaked yarn, we're going to put it in and slowly dip the yarn in. I made sure my zip ties were about the same length, so that way I am dipping approximately the same amount of yarn in at a time. And one of the reasons why you might see as I'm adding it, I'm moving the yarn back and forth. That is to help dye reach the center of these yarn areas, which is also a reason why I might sometimes come in with tongs and stir that up. But there's already less color in here than there was before. But don't forget, we will be adding a second color. And so a lot of times I'm like, oh, I need to go slow. I need to go slow. And here I'm really trying to do that because it's not that I want white on the other side. I don't mind if we have pigment on the whole thing, but we do want most of the color at this one end. But you can already see that we have a difference in our red and then the pink as we are going. And each time as you add more and more white, you can get a sense of how much, or in this case, how little color is remaining in here. If you want the colors to strike a little faster, the best way to do that is to have more acid. But what you risk with having more acid is getting less even coverage of your color on the yarn. And so one thing we could do is we could leave the yarn in here and leave the other half out of the pot. If you want to make sure that you don't end up with too much pigment on the other end. Or what we can do is add all of the yarn, and you can see it's pretty pretty steamy, but you can see that there's a difference between that palest of pink and our deepest color over here. So that part is really, really up to you, what you want to do. And I think actually I will leave our palest end leaning out of the pot a bit. And we're gonna leave this in here for, maybe 5 to 10 minutes to let it absorb as much of that leftover color as possible. And here's a better view, so you can see how I'm leaving the yarn just so we can maintain that pastel at that end. Not that it'll matter, because I'm planning to use an even deeper color for the next round, but I think that it should be really great. Okay, I'm briefly gonna turn off the heat on this pot, and we'll see almost all of that color absorbed, and we have a beautiful little dip dyed gradient, which would give us a nice repeating colorway. This would not be a quote gradient yarn, but what we have is a repeating color that slowly transitions from red to a pale pink and back again. And so depending on the kind of project you knit with this, you could end up with it pooling in spirals or getting something like micro stripes because of the length that we have here. Now I want to let this cool off. It doesn't need to cool completely, but enough so I can comfortably handle it and transfer these zip ties down to the deepest end so we can dip dye this into a second color. I reset my pot and dyed a second round of red yarn using the exact same amount of dye, also using 200 grams of yarn. The overall gradient and dip dyed colorway will be slightly different just because of the way timing could work, but I decided that even though there's so many different ways that we can dip dye yarn, I figured that I will do 2 different types of dip dye on the second round versus also just doing 2 different kinds on the first, just to show some different types of effects that we can create. But the possibilities for adding the second color when you have something that is not solid to begin with, there are so many different ways that you could rotate the yarn, and we'll talk about all of that in a moment. There are many ways that we can go about this for the next round of dip dyeing. The classic way, and one way I'm going to do today, is to dip dye the lightest end into our second color first. And so what that will do will give us a deepest color of color 2 down here, but also it will be more true because this red will make less of an influence on that color. And then we will have a gradient that may or may not go all the way up. We'll kind of see and feel how it goes. So our midpoint really could be anywhere along here. It just depends on where we put that color. Now, we also could dip dye starting at our deepest end already and keep this pale pink and stop at any point. So we could add a little bit more pigment and color down to this end and sort of blend it up a little bit with dip dyeing. So there's many, many choices already. We can twist the skein and dip dye from this end right here. And if you think about it, this will give varying shades in these midsections where we have a medium amount of color number 2 coming up. So that'll be another unique colorway. Finally, one way that we could go about this is to fold the yarn in half. And so we can actually dip the yarn in this way or even that way and keep maybe the deepest and lightest pure, or have those get the most covered. So each of these would result in different types of colorways. Now I can only do 2 of the variations in this video, and I am going to start by doing the first one that I mentioned. So I'm going to be moving our zip ties very carefully to the deepest end, and we are going to go and dip dye this into a second color. So we will have our lightest area covered up with another color, but we'll mostly preserve or completely preserve some of the red down at the other end. Ultimately, the final colors that you get depend on the amount of dye that you've added, the rate that you dip dye the yarn to the pot, and then also just like how fast that color absorbs. So there's little variables from the actual dipping technique, but when it comes to adding a second color on, you could come up with many, many different ways to fold. I suppose you could even fold it into thirds. There's so many ways that you can manipulate your skein to dip it to create your variegated colorway. And this is something that you should have a lot of fun with. I added another 4 cups of water and 2 tablespoons of white vinegar to our pot, and we're heating it up to start round 2. We are going to add 100 milliliters of a 1% stock solution again. This time the color is Blued Steel from Dharma Trading Company, which is a very almost navy-like color. So we might get some purplish hues in there. It might almost feel black on one end. It's hard to know exactly until we do it. But first we need to let this heat up until about a simmer, and then we will come and dip dye our yarn. I'm going to reduce the heat. Then let's start dip dyeing. So again, you can see with that darkest color going in first, that we're not going to have that white left behind. Not one bit. And we're not going to end up with like a pale blue or something either, because we're going on to red. But it's going to be really, really pretty. And so you can see that as we have less of the blue color on, it layers over and is very, very pretty. But we just want to go nice and slow. And each time we go back in, we're adding a little more yarn, because we don't want it to feel like a step. If you were to dip dye and just add like a little bit more, and then wait a period of time and a little more, you know, and every so often add a little more, you might end up with a bigger difference in the color versus having something that feels like softer, more blended transition between the 2 colors. This is really, really pretty already. The other thing is that we don't have to use all of the dye. So if I decide at some point that I like the way that the colors are, I can stop and then go and steam set the yarn, because actually I am thinking I kind of like it right here. Let me grab, actually I can sort of layer it like this for a sec. I'm grabbing a pan so I can show you guys what the color is like. And that liquid coming out has a little bit of blue, but not a ton. Actually, I'm going to remove some of that liquid so I can put it down here in the pan. And so the thing I'm liking right now is that we've got this navy, this sort of burgundy-ish purple, but then still a lot of bright red. And I like the way they fade in and the amount of brightness and the balance and the amount of color that we have right here. I like that we have these purple notes, but then the end feels very, very blue. There is some variation around the end, but I don't want it to get too much darker. So there's things that we could do to like not have too much dye. I guess I'm just going to go in a tiny bit more. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's very much color. There is going to be some variation. I can see visually that there is some less even absorption in some of those intermediate areas, like right here. I see some more burgundy and some more blue, but maybe I wasn't stirring it enough as it was going in, but that's really not a problem. It'll just give some variation to the color, which I think is really pretty. Okay, I'm actually going to remove this. I will, since these colors are intense, I do want to go ahead and steam set it. So I'm going to place this into a steamer basket for probably about 20 minutes. I don't always go and steam set my yarn after I have dip dyed, but when the colors are this intense, I really want to make sure that color is well set. As for the rest of Blued Steel in the pot, I wanted to absorb the color before we reset to do the other colorway. And therefore, I quickly dip dyed a skein of dry Stroll fingering weight yarn, which is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, into the pot to absorb this leftover color. As you can see, there really wasn't that much pigment left in the pot. I think that if I had gone ahead and added our whole beautiful, beautiful vibrant colors right here, I think if I had added that into the pot all the way, the blue wouldn't have made a huge difference. But sometimes with a deep color like that, it can be harder to visualize just how much pigment is left. But we have a beautiful pastel colorway right here, and so I'm going to leave it in the pot for about 15-20 minutes or so. Okay, I'm going to remove this color, which is so subtle. Oh my gosh. Part of me wants to keep this subtle one the way it is, and part of me I have a little bit of leftover dye from like our measuring containers. Part of me wants to use it for that yarn mop. So we will think about that. As for the second dip dye, I think I actually want to play with this and play with sort of shifting it so the lightest section is in the middle, just to see how different it is. I was really pleased with how it combined with the red and gave us those beautiful intermediate purples, and so I think it would be fun to see just how it ends up looking here and what kind of hues we see on this more white section. But let me know down in the comments what you would like to see, because you know, something that we could do, and I'm happy to redo this and look at some of those other options. You know, we could dip in like this, we could dip in like this, preserving the lightest color. There are a lot of options, and you don't have to stop at just 2 colors. We can play with this so many different ways. So again, if you want to see more in sort of a part 2 of this, let me know down in the comments below, and feel free to give some color suggestions on what 2 colors you would like me to play with together. I am going to add another 100 grams of Blued Steel, stir this up, and then we will dip dye. Okay, I'm going to reduce the heat to low, and we're going to come in with our yarn, and we're going to start dipping in one of the medium reds first, with a medium at the other end, but we've got our lightest pink sort of in the middle. And we're going to go up and down and up and down, and it's going to be interesting to see what kind of colors we get as we dip over that lightest section. Just dipping nice and slow. And again, you can choose where to stop at almost any point. That is something that is totally up to you. There are some differences between these 2 skeins just right off the bat. I'm going a little bit faster because I decided I wanted to cover up that lightest pink, but not too fast. And bringing the tongs to move it around in a little bit. But this is pretty, and there's definitely more differences in the hues that we see this time. But I'm also going to say there's more differences between the 2 skeins. Now, one thing I wanted to add is that it can be really difficult to dye more than around 200 grams with this technique. The yarn does start to get a little bit heavy as you dip in and out. So that's just something to keep in mind. And the colorways, they're similar, but also different. And I'm letting myself add more of the color up towards the top this time because I'm kind of liking that. But again, I am thinking I'm almost satisfied, and there's not that much pigment that remains. But I'm thinking I might want to stop. I'm thinking I might want to stop. But let's stop and take a look at it, and then I'll decide if I want to add more of this blue on. I think it's a little harder to tell the differences, but we've got almost a more periwinkle side than a more reddish blurple side. This is really, really cool. There are more hues in this yarn because of the way we shifted it, and because this shows more mixtures between the colors at different proportions, which is really, really fun. But I will say, they do feel, the two skeins do feel a little bit more different. Like this one feels a little bit paler than the other one. Yeah, so I think in terms of consistency, maybe it's a little less consistent, but I think what I'm gonna do is set this aside. I'm pretty happy with it. I will go ahead and steam it for around 15 minutes or so just to take care of that. And I am bringing our pastel in. Back in. I don't think there's actually that much pigment in here, so I think we'll still end up with a nice pastel. Sometimes if you're satisfied with the color on your yarn, even if there's some color left in the pot, it's okay to just stop. Because there have been a few times when I've added all the yarn to a pot, I've then regretted that there was a hint too much color and that I didn't preserve the hues that I wanted to preserve. So I am going to go ahead and let this sit in the pot, probably also for about 15 minutes to absorb that color. And then we've actually got a little bit more dye, which maybe we will use on a second bonus skein. We have a little bit of color left just from what was left inside the graduated cylinder in both the blue and red. So I decided to do a little more dip dyeing, starting with our little bit of red, and then till all that was absorbed, and then I took the yarn out, added the last bit of blue, and dip dyed the yarn in again in the same way. So the lightest was the same end in each of the two cases, but the rates and the way I layered the colors and the rates at which I dipped were slightly different, which would give us a little fun variation of color on this final skein of yarn. First, let's wash our bonus colors. The dip dyed in pink and then blue gives us some really beautiful tonal variation where it's more pink and more purple. And we see those multiple tones in there, and it's just so, so pretty. There's no color bleeding. I will add a little bit of some dish soap, and then we will rinse this soap out, put the yarn through the spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. And we'll come back and wash our more concentrated colors. Now we are going to wash our more concentrated colors that had cooled completely. And these colors are so saturated and vibrant that I am really, really hoping we do not see any bleeding. I've got all 4 skeins right here, and so far, so good. I am going to add some dish soap. Normally, if I can, I like to use clear, just in case the soap influences the color, but I am not expecting any bleeding today. Always make sure that you wash your yarn dyed with acid dyes with cool water. Warm water or water that is slightly alkaline can cause some bleeding. But as I mentioned, my tap water runs slightly acidic, so this could be a reason why you might see differences using the same proportions from what I see here. But there is no bleeding whatsoever. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse out all of the soap from this yarn, put it through my spin dryer, and then hang it up to dry. Dip dyeing yarn is so much fun, and there are so many different possibilities that can result in very different variegated colorways. This time when we dipped starting with one end and then dipped starting with the second end in another color, we have a colorway that goes back and forth, going through similar intermediate hues in the middle. The second time we dipped starting with, I guess, this end, then we shifted the yarn and dipped at a midpoint. So this way we have unique colors all the way around, which will work up in a different way. But as we discussed, there are so many other ways that we could dip. And really, you could take this and go into a third color. And if you're interested in me exploring more combinations of dip dyeing yarn into two different colors, let me know down in the comments below, and this is something we can investigate more in another episode of Dyepot Weekly. This BFL high twist yarn from Wool to Dye For is so fun. I love high twist yarn in general, and the Superwash Blueface Leicester nylon blend is just stunning, and I really love it, and don't know why I don't dye it more often. Dip dyeing does have a element of not randomness but variability to it, in that if you're going to try to create the same colorway in two different instances, there will be some variation over where those colors transition. I'm sure you could practice and sort of bring it down to a science so you can get things that are really, really close time after time, but the best way to get a matched similar dye lot would be to dip dye the yarn at the same time. And as I mentioned, this gets harder the more yarn you're using. I don't think I could really go much beyond 300 grams unless I had a much, much larger pot. When we have a lab partner for a Dyepot Weekly episode, I always like to pick my favorite colorway as the one to send them. And Katie, I think this has to be my favorite this time. Look at all of these different hues we got from mixing together the two colors, the blued steel and the fire red. I see reds, pinks, lavenders, dusty blues, navies, eggplant purple. It is just so fun, and it's this repeating colorway could pool depending on what you turn it into, or you could get something that feels more like micro stripes as you move around with these colors on your project. And I really, really hope, Katie, that you love the yarn, and thank you, thank you, thank you for being today's Dyepot Weekly Lab Partner. But just look at the little shift, what a difference it makes in the way that the colors repeat around these two skeins. Finally, we had two last colorways that we dip dyed using some leftover dye. In the first skein, we used the remnant blued steel in the pot. As I was dip dyeing my other yarn, I was satisfied with the color, so I removed it from the pot. You generally want to let the color exhaust, which means that the water left behind looks clear, but sometimes if you're satisfied with the color, remove it from the pot and add it to just a clear pot, or you can go and steam set it, which is what I did today. And so we've got this extremely subtle denim-y grayish blue color here. And then I had a little bit of extra dye from rinsing out the graduated cylinder. And I dip dyed this skein twice as well. First into our red and then into our blue, which gives us this beautiful lavender, blue, and pink all the way up into a little bit of white at the other end. And so you can get something really, really subtle, or even more subtle in terms of tone, but still variegated in the hue with dip dyeing. It just depends on how you layer it. Katie, thank you again for supporting this dip dye extravaganza and being today's lab partner. If you as a viewer would like to learn how you can become a lab partner to support an episode of Dyepot Weekly and get some yarn dyed in that video, you can find more details in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. In addition to lab partners and last minute lab partners, there are hundreds of skeins of hand-dyed yarn that have been featured in my videos, and so you can support the content by buying some of the hand-dyed yarn, and you get some beautiful yarn at the same time. You can find links to all of these listings that I've mentioned down in the video description. Don't forget to subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I always publish 2 videos a week at least on Tuesday and Friday mornings. You can always expect new content, but we also do live streams and bonus videos and have a lot of fun along the way. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and dip dyeing really is one of my favorite techniques. I like that level of control that I get over the colors, and sometimes you can get some really fun things to happen in the pot, like with color breaking. And sometimes the videos I film are using a technique I'm really comfortable with, and other times I'm experimenting and trying things for the first time on camera. But it all comes down to playing with color and having fun to see what we can create. And I really hope that you have enjoyed tuning in on this journey. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.